lots of Conservatives calling this a traditional Labour budget, of course, meaning that disparagingly. Andrew, in your reaction for the New Statesman, you've called it a great gamble. Going to ask you both what you make of it. Andrew, kick us off.
Well, as I'm sure George will agree, huge. The scale, very, very big. Bigger than Dennis Healey, 1975, bigger than Geoffrey Howe, bigger than Gordon Brown. Even in Labour budget terms, this is a really huge one. And it's designed to set the country on a different course. And it will set the country on a different course. I think there are two obvious and immediate gambles in it. One is the reaction of the bond markets to the huge amount of money that Rachel Reeves is borrowing. And there was a worrying spike overnight, but it seems to have calmed down. And my best guess is that because she has in fact tightened the fiscal rules, not extending them, as the New Statesman was talking about, to 10 years, but putting them back to 3 years, that will help calm the bond markets. And in short, I think, fingers and toes crossed, she will get away with that. But the bigger and in a sense more important gamble, I think we can talk about a lot, is that she thinks that despite the new workers' rights regulations, despite the new minimum wage, despite the increase in employers' national insurance contributions and capital gains tax, all this coming together, businesses will shrug and shoulder and keep going, keep employing, keep investing and allow the economy to keep growing. I think that is one hell of a risk.
George?
I think there are a lot of big numbers in this in this red book here, which is notably fatter than the progressively slim volumes we had under the Conservatives, and that's really a testament to the fact this is their interventionist government. It's clearly set us on a path to a bigger state, public spending peaking at about 44.5% of GDP, tax take rising to a record high. It's a really interesting table in the OBR document, which shows by 2030 will be roughly level with the Netherlands in terms of the tax take, not that far off Germany, which of course will beg the question, will our public services be as good as theirs?
It's something that David Gork writes about, doesn't he? That it is kind of, we're moving towards social democracy a la the continent.
There's a definite trend, and added to that, you've got the workers' rights, which she hailed in the speech, a big increase in the minimum wage, a more interventionist state. So there is a clear model here. The big problem for Labour, I think, is in the Red Book how negative or disappointing the growth forecasts are. So there's a temporary rise in growth next year to 2%. Otherwise, over the 5-year period, growth averaging 1.66%. Not the transformation that Reeves wants and has promised. Now, Labour aides respond by saying, look, the OBR acknowledged they can't take into account the planning reforms, for instance, and how they could boost growth because they haven't been finalised yet. They argue we're at the beginning of a decade of national renewal, as they put it, and it's basically too early to say. But if growth does disappoint, it's worth remembering the OBR has a habit of being over optimistic on growth, then Reeves will face a very difficult choice midterm, because if you look at the numbers, they're cuts to unprotected government departments that are penciled in for future years. It's exactly what her Conservative predecessors used to do. If growth doesn't improve, she will face a difficult choice between going ahead with those cuts or raising taxes again.
But help me understand this, because everything we've heard from this Labour government is growth, growth, growth. This is what's going to underpin our entire approach. And then we have this budget, huge amounts of tax raised, but we're not seeing the growth. I mean, this is hugely disappointing, isn't it?
Well, you can't click your fingers and get growth. That is her problem. I thought the most interesting sentence she said during her budget speech was when she was announcing the employers' national insurance contributions, and there was an enormous hubbub, an uproar in the chamber of horror about this. And she said, well, you can't have successful businesses if you don't have a health service that works and you've got healthy workers. You can't have successful businesses if your workers aren't properly educated and all of that. And you can't have successful businesses if the public finances are awry. So, in other words, she is gambling upon the idea that business, slightly medium to longer term, will look at this and will think, OK, we've got more workers' rights to deal with. We've got more minimum pay to deal with. But actually, this is a stable social democratic government investing in the public realm in a way that will underpin our customers and underpin our workers, and we will keep growing, and that will happen. That is her great gamble. Now, I think things are, as George says, there's lots of tough things ahead. I think it's slightly worse than that in a sense. If you look at real wages 3 or 4 years down the line, they look absolutely stagnant. And, we have come through a period, and the general election was part of it, of a very, very turbulent time in politics where huge numbers of voters are just furious with the powers that be. Now, if by the time of the next election, voters are not feeling much benefit in their pockets and the public services are only just beginning to recover, how are they going to react? Are they going to stick with Social Democratic Labour or go somewhere entirely different?
No, because the fear is that this rise in the national insurance contributions paid by employers, inevitably, the OBR predicted about 3/4 of that is going to be passed on to workers in the form of lower wage growth.
That's right.
So, yeah, it's quite frightening, isn't it? Both Rachel Reeves and Rishi Sunak, who was responding to the budget yesterday, talked a lot about choices. Reeves perhaps saying these choices were forced upon her because of the inheritance that Labour had from the previous government. Sunak suggesting, no, not at all. These are the ones she's made for herself. Do you think Labour have made the case strongly enough for such large tax increases?
Any sentence starting, do you think Labour have made the case strongly enough, gets the answer no at the moment, and certainly does with that one. I would defend a lot of the choices she has made. She's putting more money into council housing. That's very good. She has raised the minimum wage quite substantially. That's very good. And, when the Tory press says, she's just bunging all this money at her union paymasters, they're not going to the union paymasters. They are going to public sector workers who have had a very, very hard time for the last 15 years and really need a wage hike. And that money, by the way, will come back into the economy. So I think she has made some very strong traditional Labour sort of social democratic choices in this as well.
On tax, if you read between the lines, it was always clear what approach Reeves and Starmer were going to take. At the general election, I wrote this at the time, they said, there will be no return to austerity. Now, the only way that they could keep their pledge was always going to be more tax rises than expected. And I said, I expect Rachel Reeves will come to power and discover the books are worse than thought and raise taxes. And that's exactly what she's done. And that's a clear political choice. The reason she's made that choice, you look at the polling, voters often put the NHS as their number one concern. Polls show that they are happy to live with higher taxes in return for improved public services, ideally paid by someone else. And that's why, politically, she was very careful to say, I'm protecting employees' pay slips. So it's a rather tricksy distinction, but who's being hit? And she called them out in her speech. Private schools will pay VAT on fees. Non-doms, private equity managers, private jet users, pointing at one Rishi Sunak.
Yes.
So, as I wrote, this was a very class-conscious speech that she was drawing, using dividing lines reminiscent of Gordon Brown and public spending, but with more of a class-based edge. And she said, look, my sixth form was a couple of prefab huts in a yard, sitting across the Winchester-educated Rishi Sunak. That she lent into that element of class war, if you like, and that really shows you who Labour think are their people. They're going for the sort of working class, lower middle class voters who often decide elections and who, in key swing seats, went from the Conservatives to Labour. That's also why they knocked a penny off a pint, an easy way to get some popular headlines, but also far greater cost, kept the fuel duty freeze. You had a real sense of of who she sees as her political friends and enemies.
And the tax rise, which didn't happen, which is her decision to get rid of so-called fiscal drag.
Yeah.
This business of freezing thresholds, so more and more millions of people are drawn into higher tax rates. Now, I think we all kind of assumed she would carry on doing that. It's a relatively easy tax rise. It doesn't grab the headlines. The Tories did it for a long time, so they can't complain about it. But by not doing that, I think that is her answer to the charge that she broke her election pledges and is indeed putting higher taxes on working people. I think, by not going for fiscal drag, she can say, actually, I have done something that was difficult and expensive for the Treasury in order to ensure that most working people aren't paying higher rates of tax.
Do you think that's also an appeal to middle class voters? Because, George, you've said that there's plenty appealing there to perhaps working class voters, lower middle class voters. But the other way of looking at the VAT increase on school fees is that the charge has been levelled. That's an attack on aspiration. Is she trying to manage some of that with
certainly,
the fiscal drag point?
The very rich are very angry. And there's a whole range of things from the private schools, no doubt, to the private jets, but also to some of the capital gains tax changes that are very wide. And of course, the farming community is furious about the effect of inheritance tax on family farms. So there are specific groups who are very, very angry. The question is, will many of them actually leave the country? Will they pull money out of Britain? Well, we'll see. In the past, there's been a lot of anger, a lot of thunderous editorials in the Daily Telegraph and elsewhere. And in the end, not very much has happened. But eventually, of course, they can go and they will go. One of the problems I think Rachel Reeves and any chancellor has these days is that international capital and the super rich are even more mobile than they used to be. And there are places like Italy and Switzerland which are actively trying to lure people from the UK. And if that happens too much, that's another problem for her in the future.
But I don't think the super rich, parents that choose to send their kids to private school are not necessarily the super rich, are they?
No, well Rachel Reeves said in her speech, I remind the House, 94% of children are educated at state schools. So Labour are clearly happy to lose some votes over this. It's quite interesting. The Lib Dems oppose it, and you can completely understand why. Because I think if your base is really the blue wall, where a lot of the top public schools concentrated, you do have more of an issue. So I think that's a political dividing line that they're comfortable with. It's interesting on the rich. I was hearing from tax lawyers, tax accountants yesterday, for instance, that some of the rich were more worried about this budget, that they thought it was going to be harder for them. They thought she might go all the way and equalise capital gains and income tax. They thought she might introduce a gift tax. She hasn't been as radical as some on the left wanted. And that really shows the balancing act she's trying to pull off, which is that she's taxing more, she's spending more, she's prioritising the low paid. But she also wants good relations with business. She's not actually looking for conflict with them. It's a very sort of consensual model. Pro-business, pro-worker is their mantra. And that's another clear political choice.
Andrew, when you spoke to Rachel Reeves before the budget, she said that those with the broadest shoulders would bear the largest burden. We talked about the impact of taxes on the super rich, but do you think this national insurance contribution rise, which our own business editor Will Dunn has described as a stealth tax, do you think she's followed through with that, or what's your assessment?
Well, as ever with Will, that's a very shrewd way of putting it. I was thinking of it as it being a little bit like so-called fiscal drag or freezing the thresholds. It is a very big tax increase that most people, for most of the time, frankly, won't notice. It will kind of trickle across the society and the economy over months and years as perhaps people get slightly less wage increases than they were hoping for, and perhaps this company here hires 10 people rather than 20 people, and that becomes cumulatively very important. But it's not something that people are going to get up tomorrow morning and be absolutely raging about. To that extent, it is a stealth tax, and it is clever.
Do you think she's lived up to what she said to you, prior, that
Yes.
the largest burden will be
By and large, I think
with
that's quite clearly the case. I think if you look at what she's done on minimum wage, if you look at how she has sprinkled some of the relatively small amounts of money outside health into things like school breakfast clubs, into a bit more council housing, I think you can see that she is focusing, as George says, very much on what we used to call working class or lower middle class voters at the expense of people who have shares to sell or second homes and all that. So I think it is a budget which is targeted at the caricature Daily Telegraph Spectator reading voter, and in favour of, as it were, traditional Labour voters. I came away from that interview saying that I thought Rachel Reeves was turning out to be a more traditional Labour Chancellor than we had perhaps expected, and I feel mildly vindicated.
George, is there an argument to be made that it didn't go far enough in some areas? Because, we hear this as a government who wants green growth, and yet keeping the fuel duty freeze and that temporary 5p cut doesn't really support that, does it?
Yeah, this shows the real tension between political priorities, keeping motorists on side. It's no surprise they haven't picked a fight with them, and the green rhetoric, as you say. I also think it wasn't a budget that spoke about growth perhaps as much as some would have expected. You've got that big increase in public investment, which she noted the IMF, among others, back, and which economists say will help boost productivity, which has been such a big problem. But I don't think necessarily everyone would come away from that feeling as if they've got a clear sense of Labour's overall growth plan. I've mentioned the planning reforms, but I noted in a piece today that Brexit loomed over this budget, only mentioned by Rachel Reeves once, where she criticised the Conservatives' Brexit deal as bad for business. But if you look in the OBR document, normal forecasts will hit UK's trade intensity, as they call it, by 15% in the long term. So the forecast is still Brexit's depressing growth. Now that's one area where we don't expect Labour to diverge from what they said before the election. But I think at some point, particularly because this theme of us becoming a more European-style economy is one that a lot of people are noting. People say, well, what separates us from our European peers? We're not in the single market. And business, I think, will start talking about that at some point, because if the model cannot simply be we're going to just tax and spend. Reeves herself has said you can't just tax and spend your way to growth. So boosting trade will become key. That is going to pose the question, what relationship do you really want with your biggest and closest trading partner?
We should remember, of course, that all the European economies are in trouble of different kinds alongside us. The Germans are having a very, very hard time. The French are facing a 60 billion euro package of austerity cuts, way beyond what we can imagine. So everybody's facing the same kind of problems. But George is absolutely right. A budget can set the course in domestic terms. It can't protect you from the shocks and the bumps in the road ahead. And one really big one I think nobody has talked about nearly enough is the possible re-election of Donald Trump if that happens. Because don't forget, Donald Trump says that his favourite word is tariffs. He says in specific terms he's going to introduce 60% tariffs on Chinese goods, which will provoke a global trade war. But he also wants up to 20% tariffs on goods from other nations, including the UK. And economists who've studied that say this would be an equivalent cut in our export economy of 4%, which is in fact slightly bigger even than Brexit.
We were talking about this amongst colleagues this morning, in fact, about what happens if that exact scenario happens. And it changes everything, doesn't it?
I think, frankly, the question of whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump is an existential one for the entire Western political economy. It's not just about tariffs. It's not just about Ukraine. It's not just about the Middle East. But I think it will tilt everything. It'll change everything. And it will change millions of people's attitudes to the stability of democracy as a form of governance. It's a massive, massive moment.